Okay. Okay, I think we can, let me let 2 more people in. And great. Middle. Okay, I think we're ready to start.
Okay.
Okay, I think we can. Let me let 2 more people in. Wait a second, what's going on here? Now I'm okay. So just great. Middle. Okay, I think we're ready to. There was an echo from YouTube. So I think we're going to start with Margaret.
Okay.
Is that
Good
right?
afternoon, everyone. My name's Margaret McCormick, and I'm director at the Woods Hole Public Library. For those of you that are unfamiliar with our library, we are the Fieldstone building at the end of Woods Hole Road, just before the road becomes Water Street. We're a small, independent public library, and this means that we're a nonprofit and that we benefit from about 10% of support from the town of Falmouth. The Woods Hole Library is a member of the CLAMS, the Cape and Library Network, Island Network, and that means that your CLAMS card will work at our library too. And in fact, you can check out a copy of Wanderers, any number of copies at your CLAMS library. If you haven't had the opportunity to use our library, please consider this an invitation to come by and see what we're up to. We offer a wide variety of programs for all ages and unique opportunities for those interested in becoming a volunteer. The Woods Hole Public Library is delighted to co-sponsor this program with the 300 Committee. The library has a long history of hosting book and travel programs, and we hope that this is just the beginning or the first of many collaborations with the 300 Committee. I'm going to let Lucy say the thank yous, but I do thank Pamela Rothstein and Lucy and finally Kerri for being with us this afternoon. And I just want to say your book has inspired me to read additional writings by the women in your book. So Lucy, I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret and the Woods Hole Public Library. I'm Lucy Helfrich with the 300 Committee Land Trust. We too look forward to future collaborations with the library. Before we introduce Kerri Andrews, I just want to share a few quick notes about the 300 Committee. Most of all, I want to thank our loyal members and friends who support our work to preserve and protect open spaces throughout Falmouth. Membership contributions are critical, enabling us to continue to save precious land parcels in Falmouth for conservation, recreation, and drinking water protection, to manage and steward these lands, and to provide outreach and educational programs for the public. The 300 Committee has been working for 36 years to permanently protect open space in all of Falmouth's villages. To date, we've preserved more than 2,500 acres, and there are always new parcels under review for possible acquisition. We believe that our work contributes both to Falmouth's natural beauty and to everyone's quality of life here, from Woods Hole to Hatchville and West Falmouth to Quoit. I think a lot of us have learned more than ever during the many trying months of the pandemic, just how important these special places are to us. And tying into today's talk, how important walking in these special places has become to us. Anyway, if you're not yet a 300 Committee member, we do hope you will consider joining us. And now I will turn things over to Pamela Rothstein, a friend to both the 300 Committee and the Woods Hole Public Library, who will introduce Kerri Andrews and today's program. Pamela was the one who brought Kerri and her marvelous book to our attention. Here you go, Pamela, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's truly a delight to partner with or to see the 2 organizations that I so love in our town partner in this event. And thank you to both of you, the organizations, and to Kerri for accepting the invitation. Before I tell you a little bit about Kerri, I want to be sure to tell you that Kerri has a wonderful website. It is Kerri Andrews, that's Kerri, no E, .co.uk, and I encourage you to visit it with this beautiful cover of the book, Wanderers. I don't remember how I first heard of Kerri's book, but I do remember distinctly being thoroughly engrossed and so curious that I went and got it, which is also a rarity because I'm a great library borrower. But this was a book I wanted to have so badly. Some of you might remember that I presented at the Woods Hole Library about my own solo walking adventure in Scotland and held up to you Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain. I said, you must read this book. And it was my muse and companion on my walking tour. So I just think that Kerri's book is one of those wake-up calls that we really surround us in so many areas of adding an important voice to a framework that we have for viewing the world around us and ourselves. So delighted that you're here with us and that people can get to hear about what she wrote. So Kerri is a reader in women's literature and textual editing at Edge Hill University, which I looked up and is in Lancashire. But Kerri herself lives in Scotland with her children and her husband. Kerri is not from a walking family. She undertook walking on her own, and I hope that you're going to discuss that. It's very much part of this book. Kerri has climbed more than 120 of Scotland's Munros, and she, aside from Wanderers, A History of Women Walking, which came out in September of 2020, she writes articles for The Guardian, The Great Outdoors, and Trail magazine. I was particularly taken by one of the articles for The Guardian on walking and rewalking local trails, which is, again, something that we have all done so much and enjoyed the many wonderful parcels of the 300 Committee and revisited them so much during the pandemic. So also, Kerri is one of the leaders of an organization entitled Women in the Hills, an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project aimed at exploring the factors enabling and inhibiting women's access to upland landscapes. Well, we don't have upland landscapes, but the issues are similar here in our flatlands. That project brings together people from all areas of walking, mountaineering, land access, and management to drive change in women's access and experiences. So Kerri is not only an author and a commentator bringing these things to light for us, but an active worker trying to change things today. So we applaud that work and look forward to hearing from you, Kerri. There will be a Q&A following Kerri's presentation, and you can submit your questions, and we encourage you to do so through the chat function. You can send them publicly to everyone, or if you want to, you can share them privately with me to pose. So I'm going to turn this over to Kerri.
Thank you so much to Pamela, to Lucy, to Margaret for a really warm welcome. I know we're separated by an ocean and several thousand miles, but I really feel like I'm with you, and thank you so much for extending your hospitality to me and inviting me to come along this afternoon. I'm really grateful. It's fantastic to be able to talk to you all about women's walking, and the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be thinking about women walking then and now, and thinking about some of the things about historical representations of women's walking, and also how that perhaps plays into how we feel about our own walking and what we as walkers in the moment can be doing, and what we might want to be thinking about as we go off onto our footpaths or into the wherever it is that we happen to be. For me at the moment, I'm not so much in the mountains, but in the local area, because I've got 2 young children, and trying to find the joy in that as well. So there'll be quite a lot of Dorothy Wordsworth, which I hope will please at least some people, and there'll be a bit of Nan Shepherd. So it seems like I'm going to be pushing Pam's buttons, which is fantastic, if nothing else. So I just wanted to just pick up on what Pamela mentioned about women in the hills. We've been on furlough really during the pandemic. 2 of the 3 of us have got young children, and we were doing lots of childcare, but the project is restarting in the next couple of weeks. So if you are interested in following what we do, we will be doing online events. So you will be able to participate from America if you wanted to. I'd be happy to discuss that with anyone who's interested. So in walking then and now. So what I wanted to, there we go, that's right. First technical hitch. So what I wanted to do before I move on to talking about individual women or thinking about particular women's walking was just to think a little bit about the history of walking and what we're inheriting when we're thinking about this culturally significant activity that has all this freighted meaning that we've come aware of. And one of the things that I was very interested in when I was writing Wanderers was how separated walking has become from what it was in the 18th century and earlier than that, which was the most perfectly ordinary thing that everybody did because that's just what you did. You didn't go anywhere, you didn't do anything unless you walked, unless you were really, really rich. So I think that's perhaps something useful when we're all used to receiving these stories of men, what Kathleen Jamie very plangently called the lone enraptured male, off on a hill on his own. That's the sort of history of walking that we've received, but actually walking was this very domestic, everyday, perfectly ordinary thing that everybody did. And I've been really lucky to read recently an article that's coming out in an academic journal that used the diaries of women from the 19th century. And the thing that was extraordinary about the walking there was that they talked more about when they didn't go for a walk because they were walking so much of the time. Walking was the standard, not walking was the thing that was peculiar and that required noting down. So I think we've perhaps lost a little bit of that sense of walking as a commonplace, as something that's just inherent to how a lot of people move around the landscape, how people have done so for thousands and thousands of years. So I just want to sort of bed that in, because a lot of the women that I write about in Wanderers walk in ways that is definitely not lone enraptured men. It's often not mountains, it's domestic, it's Dorothy Wordsworth going to get plants or firewood or eggs, you're walking for pleasure with small children, those sorts of walks that don't get written about. But in the 18th century, something does shift. We do start to see a move from walking as perfectly commonplace activity. As people start to have a little bit more money, they start to have a little bit more leisure time, there's a little bit more opportunity to do things for fun rather than because you have to. And at that time, there's also just coincides with the change in the way that mountain landscapes are viewed. And Robert Macfarlane writes really interestingly about this in Mountains of the Mind, the shift in the 18th century from mountains is terrifying. This is, you do not want to go in the mountains, you will die in the mountains. Mountains are dangerous, mountains are terrifying, mountains are horrifying, generating feelings of horror and awe in the worst possible ways. To sort of in the second half of the 18th century, mountains as being the location for interesting experiences, the sublime, getting in touch with some aspect of nature that is unavailable in safer environments. There's this major aesthetic shift that makes mountains increasingly desirable as places to spend time. It doesn't flip overnight. There's this whole tension all the way through the 18th century and into the 19th, where people are talking about mountains as horrible, people are going to the mountains as tourists. It's a really interesting landscape where walking starts to take on that sort of culturally significant meaning, but not in a way that's free of tension. So all that then gets tied in the 18th and the late 18th and into the 19th century with walking as a creative activity. And a lot of the blame for that can be laid at the door of the Romantic poets in the Lake District, who wrote explicitly about how walking was important for their creativity. So that's where we get a lot of the inheritance of our sense of walking. But one of the really significant things about that Romantic period of walking at the end of the 19th century, with William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, is that one of the most significant pioneers was William Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy. And I've just mentioned that she was often walking, and we will all now be familiar with the repeated rewalking of familiar paths over and over again, because that's what we can access. That's what we've had to do throughout the pandemic. And Dorothy Wordsworth absolutely did that. In every place that she lived, rewalked and retrod the same paths over and over again. And as she did so, laid them over with all sorts of really interesting meanings. And I think that's a really important part of her walking. And I think it's a really important way of walking. And that's what I was trying to talk about in the Guardian article. But tonight I wanted to talk to you about Dorothy Wordsworth, the pioneering mountaineer, because what she does in the mountains ties together what I've just been saying about this fraught transition from walking as commonplace to walking as, inspirational, creative act. So on October 7th in 1818, Dorothy Wordsworth makes what we are pretty certain is the first documented ascent to Scafell Pike in the Lake District, which is the highest mountain in England and stands at 978 metres tall. It's a fantastic walk. If you have been to the Lake District, you'll know just how fantastic it is. But the summit is terrifying. Horrible boulders. Friend I was walking with when I was up there lost the sole of his boot on these boulders. They eat shoes. But Dorothy Wordsworth climbed it by accident, and she wrote about this in a letter that she sent shortly afterwards. And the image on the slide is actually the fair copy of that letter, which is held in Grasmere. So it's a very long letter, so I've extracted part of it. And she says, "We had attained the object of our journey, but our ambition mounted higher. We saw the summit of Scafell, as it seemed, very near to us. We were indeed 3 parts up that mountain, and thither we determined to go. We found a distance greater than it had appeared to us, but our courage did not fail. However, when we came nearer, we perceived that in order to attain that summit, we must make a great dip, and that the ascent afterwards would be exceedingly steep and difficult, so that we might have been benighted if we had attempted it. Therefore, unwillingly, we gave it up, and resolved instead to ascend another point of the same mountain called the Pikes, and which I have since found the measurers of the mountains estimate as higher than the larger summit which bears the name of Scafell, and where the stone man is built, which we at the time considered as the point of highest honour." So the whole ascent is an accident. They were aiming for a different mountain. For reasons of safety, they decide not to do that, and they climb this little bitty thing, which they think is unimportant, but which is actually the highest mountain, which also tells you something about the state of surveying in England at this point as well. So I just love the happenstanceness of this, that she was never intending to climb the highest mountain in England. She just sort of did it because it was there, and then climbs it, and then writes this really fascinating letter in which she describes the whole experience, the picnic, the autumn day, the companions. She's walking with her friend Mary, who has moved to Borrowdale and has turned into the most amazing walker. And they have this fantastic day. And then they go up onto the summit of the mountain, and Dorothy has this really interesting experience. And the map that you can see is a relief map of the Lake District, of this part of the Lake District from the 1830s. So you get a sense of the lay of the land. But Dorothy's description of the summit is completely different to that which we might expect. Instead of the grand views, we get something quite different. And she says, "There on the summit, not a blade of grass was to be seen, hardly a cushion of moss, and that was parched and brown, and only growing rarely between the huge blocks and stones which cover the summit and lie in heaps all around to a great distance, like skeletons or bones of the earth not wanted at the creation, and there left to be covered with never-dying lichens which the clouds and dews nourish, and adorned with colours of the most vivid and exquisite beauty, and endless in variety. No gems or flowers can surpass in colouring the beauty of some of these masses of stone, which no human eye beholds except the shepherd led thither by chance or traveller by curiosity. And how seldom must this happen." One of the things that I like most about Dorothy Wordsworth's account of this summiting of Scafell Pike is that her view is very much downwards. It's on the immediate space around her feet. It's on this particular bit of mountain. Every other book I've read, mostly by men, has been about, oh, look at the land that I conquered, that I could see from here to here. And Dorothy does indeed do that elsewhere in the letter. She very much enjoys being able to see all the way to the Isle of Man and all the way to Scotland and all the way into Yorkshire. It's a fantastic viewpoint. But her best writing is reserved for talking about the minutiae of this summit, the intricates, the intimacy of it, the eternality of it, this permanence. These lichens have always been there, they will always be there. And what becomes fragmentary, what becomes sort of fleeting is her presence, is humanity's presence. It moves in and out of this space. It is otherwise eternal. And I like the way in which that makes the human experience so humble. It's insignificant in terms of the life of this mountain, which I think is something that Nan Shepherd speaks about really interestingly in The Living Mountain, makes the human much less significant in the story of climbing. So Dorothy Wordsworth's account, I think, is really important for a lot of reasons, but not least because of that very close focus on what's right next to her. And that's a hallmark if you've read the Al Foxton and the Grasmere journals, and indeed any of her other travel writing. That's a hallmark of how she goes about the world, is that very close, intimate focus of wherever it is, whether it's a woman's house that she's been invited into, or if it's her sister-in-law's walking habits, or if it's the summit of Scafell Pike. So it's a fascinating account. You won't have heard about it, however, necessarily, because it got absorbed into William Wordsworth's guidebook to the Lake District and was reproduced there without attribution. Whether that was by Dorothy's wish or not, we don't know. Dorothy never published any of her walking accounts, any of her journals, any of her documents. They weren't intended to be shared generally. They were always intended to be shared amongst friends and people that she knew well. So it is possible that she asked not to have her name put on that. But that's why we haven't heard about, and certainly in the general walking literature, about Dorothy's role in pioneering the sense of Scafell Pike. And just one other thing to throw in the mix here, and I'll use this as a segue to the first reading, is that speaking to a friend of mine who's also on the Women in the Hills project, who recreated this ascent on the 200th anniversary in traditional costume, which shows an enormous commitment given the vagaries of the Lake District weather in October, and wasn't by all means a pretty miserable experience, was that she went up in a traditional bonnet, an 18th century woman's bonnet. And what Joe told me about that was that it focuses your eyes downwards. You can't see much here and you can't see anything here because of the way the bonnet works. And she said you also can't hear anybody talk. Your ears are muffled. So it may well be that the way in which Dorothy focuses on the local is a product of the dress that she's wearing, which I think is a really interesting aspect of a woman's way of walking in the mountain. So I just throw that out there for your consideration. And as I say, I'm going to use that as a way into thinking about what's happening with Ellen Wheaton, who just a couple of years later is walking up Snowdon, definitely deliberately. This was a completely intended ascent. She was determined. She bought the guidebook. She took the journey. She knew where she was going, very much knew where she was going. So I'll just read a couple of pages of Ellen Wheaton's rather different experience of summiting a mountain. So on a sunny day in the middle of June 1825, Ellen Wheaton, a 48-year-old Lancashire governess travelling through Wales, set off up Snowdon alone. She was confident and strong, a capable walker who had descended some of the highest peaks in the Lake District, though none as high as Snowdon, which stands at 3,560 feet. She would have been able to see the mountains of Wales as she grew up. And she was certainly not the first woman to climb a mountain, as we've seen that Dorothy was there in 1818. But walking up mountains for anyone was an uncommon activity. It was uncommon, though, not for the reasons that we are typically assuming, fear of sexual assault or the demands of propriety, but because walking up mountains was often done with the help of a guide. And indeed, Dorothy Wordsworth climbed Scafell Pike with the help of a guide. That was just how everybody did it. There were all sorts of warnings in the guidebooks to say you must take a guide. It was considered really irresponsible not to walk with a guide. What made Wheaton eccentric in her desire to climb Snowdon was not so much her sex as her her bravery, let's go for that. Having been espied by men on her descent, on their descent, Wheaton sought to avoid them, not only because she had no desire to be publicly labelled as peculiar, but because she wished to pursue her walk independently. So this is Wheaton herself. The guide, seeing I was out of the path, only because he was in it, if he had but known, called out to me, but I was quite deaf. He continued shouting, and I was forced to hear. He was telling me to keep in the copper path, etc., etc., etc. I knew the way perfectly well, for my map and my guide had been well studied at home. I could find from what the gentleman said that he imagined I had called for the guide at his dwelling, and finding him engaged upon the mountain, had gone so far to meet him, for he entreated the man to leave him. I never turned my face towards them, but walked as fast as I could, the guide again giving me some directions, with the best of intentions, I'm sure. So having avoided having to take a guide, which he very much earnestly wants to not have to do, Wheaton heads off up Snowdon. And as she climbs, she discovers a glorious sense of isolation. She writes, "Here I stood, perched on a ridge like a crow on the point of a pinnacle. Not a human creature could I see anywhere. For aught I knew, I had the whole mountain to herself." Not far before me, she says, the path wound along a most awful precipice. Now I was startled for the first time. This was wholly unexpected. I hesitated some time. There was no crossing lower down. I must either return home as I had come or climb the only way there was. I had taken the precaution on coming to Carnarvon to write my address on a card, both to my lodgings there and my dwelling at Prescott, and wore it in my pocket, so that if any accident should befall me, whoever found me would discover where to apply. Strange feelings and ideas mingle. The next moment I raised the thought aloft to him who is the highest. So the danger that she experiences here is considerable. But what she then writes and goes on to write is, whilst crossing the ridge, perhaps 100 yards, perhaps 200, or even more, for I was too terrified to ascertain. The precipice on my right and left was too much for my head to bear. On my right, if I slipped ever so little, nothing could save me. And oh, it looked like an eternity of falling. It seemed to my giddy head half a mile down. So cragfast on Snowdon, she decides eventually to draw her bonnet close over my right cheek to hoodwink me on that side. So the bonnet there, which in some ways was quite restrictive, comes to Wheaton's aid as a way of enabling her to move past this extraordinary precipice that gives her all sorts of terrors and makes her appeal to God to save her life. So I just thought there was a nice sort of parallel between what Dorothy Wordsworth was doing and what she was wearing, and the way in which that perhaps focuses her attention on the narrowness of the summit, and the way in which Wheaton, a few years later, is using that same dress for different purposes, but also to facilitate women's access to the mountains. So a little bit of Ellen Wheaton there. So I've included here one of Dorothy's lesser known poems, because what happened to Dorothy was really quite sad. That after years and years and years of walking as her brother's companion and walking on her own as well, was that she became very ill and eventually completely immobilized. Early onset, well, not early onset, but she became senile, found it very difficult to move around at all, but didn't lose the memories of what it was to be a mountaineer. And I just wanted to include this poem, which you may not have encountered before. So this is Dorothy Wordsworth, Thoughts on My Sickbed, which she wrote in 1832. And has the remnant of my life been pilfered of this sunny spring, and have its own prelusive sounds touched in my heart, no echoing string, she writes. And she goes on to talk about the illness that she's experienced. I felt a power unfelt before, controlling weakness, languor, pain. It bore me to the terrace walk. I trod the hills again. No prisoner in this lonely room. I saw the green banks of the Wye, recalling thy prophetic words, bard, brother, friend from infancy. No need of motion or of strength, or even the breathing air. I thought of nature's loveliest scenes, and with memory, I was there. And I think one of the things that's most beautiful about this poem is that the way in which all those years of walking turn up as solace and comfort for her in this very difficult older age, made perhaps more difficult by the fact that her ill health was blamed by her family on her extraordinary physical capacity as a walker, that she had walked too much. Something that William Wordsworth would warn Harriet Martineau about later, not to overdo it because it had driven his sister mad. But I don't think she's mad at all in this poem. And it's a sad end to a life of mountaineering pleasure. But I think there's some consolation in the fact that she was able to recall those experiences and draw on them when she was lying on her sickbed. So I wanted to just move the discussion a little bit closer to our own time and talk a little bit about a completely different kind of walker, Isabel Wily Hutchinson, who came from a completely different background to Dorothy Wordsworth, who was orphaned at a very young age, lived moving from pillar to post, different family members taking her in for a few years at a time, never having a home of her own to call, never having anywhere to set up until she was heading towards her 30s when she moved in with her brother William. Isabel Wily Hutchinson, in contrast, born into a wealthy family with a very, very nice fancy house in West Lothian, not far from where I live. But someone who had horrible experiences as a young woman, and who then set off walking across Scotland. And Isabel Wily Hutchinson's walking career just sort of exploded from there. So she walks across Scotland in long walks, then walks across the islands, decides that's not enough, walks to Iceland, scandalizes the locals by wanting to walk all around the island, even though there were no guides, even though there were no maps. No one would take her, but she went anyway. Iceland isn't enough. She goes to Greenland. Greenland isn't enough. She goes to the Arctic Circle. She goes to the Aleutian Islands, and she travels all through the Arctic. And not only was she an extraordinary walker, but she's also botanizing while she's there. She's writing poetry while she's there. And I think she's just absolutely fantastic as someone who was walking for different reasons. Someone who was just completely physically capable. So if you do happen to come to Scotland in the next few months, you might want to go to the National Library of Scotland, which is currently running an exhibition called Petticoats to Pinnacles, in which Wily Hutchinson's work features quite prominently. It's all about women's mountaineering and walking and how that's developed over time. So it's just mostly as an excuse to show some pictures of Scotland looking beautiful. Here is a view of the Trossachs, which is also an area where Dorothy Wordsworth walked with her brother when they took a tour to Scotland. So there is synchronicity here between Dorothy Wordsworth and Isabel Wily Hutchinson. But just to give you a flavour of what her walking was like. So on April 28th, 1928, she climbs Ben Ledi, which is not a Munro, which is a mountain over 917 metres, but it's still a substantial lump of rock. It's a big climb. Lovely hot day. I climbed Ben Ledi by myself. It was lovely up there. I took about 4.5 hours in all. Some snow on top, met stag and about 6 or 7 hinds quite close. Had lunch on top and glorious view of 7 or 8 lochs. Helen Peter and her aunt at tea. Now, one of the things that I was very surprised about when I was writing Wanderers was how infrequently the women talked about any sense of fear about being out there on their own. That was an idea that I'd inherited, and I don't quite know where from. It sort of imbued it from the atmosphere, but it's certainly not reflected in the way that women wrote about their walking. Dorothy Wordsworth only once mentions it, and that's a flight of fancy. And here we've got a perfectly confident woman. Off she goes up a mountain, has a fantastic day, thank you ever so much, really enjoys it. So I just wanted to throw that out there, as well as a way of thinking differently about women's walking, that it's not about threat, and it's not, women are not obsessed about the bodily state. Ellen Wheaton's only frightened because she might actually die. She's not frightened because she's afraid of what men are going to do to her. She's frightened because she will actually fall off a mountain. And here we've got Isabel Wily Hutchinson, who doesn't entertain a fear at all. This is the most natural thing to do. And it's written about in the same tone of voice as Who's Come to Tea. And she goes off further and further, and also a pioneering ascender of mountains. So this time she's in Greenland, and thinking about the experience of walking on this mountain that no one's touched for 50 years, as far as she is aware, talking about the vast hush that breathed round, the silence all unstirred by human foot or human sound, passage of beast or bird. No living foot for 50 years had stirred that solemn height, only the silence of the spheres, the passing day and night. Above, below, the crystal breath of pristine ice and frost, such peace as on the face that death, its white wings, has crossed. And poetry was the form of writing that Isabel Wily Hutchinson started out in. She began as a poet. So there's a lot of that woven into her walking literature, the way in which she experiences walking, the way she commemorates that walking. And I think, again, this, that women are there right at the top of these mountains, pioneering ascents, doing things that nobody else has done before. We've just somehow not known that or remembered that. But similar and different ideas here to Dorothy Wordsworth as well. So I wanted to sort of move from what these women are doing, that we know they were doing. We've got the documentary evidence, we've got the letters, we've got the poetry, we've got the journals, to why I started writing Wanderers. And it's because the men who write about walking really annoyed me. There's a stronger phrase that I'd like to use, but they just really annoyed me. And that's where it started. The first notes in my journal that became Wanderers was, why does no one write about this stuff? And it was these phrases in particular that really got my goat. So Merlin Covey writing in 2012, the act of walking takes on a highly significant, indeed pivotal role, becomes the means through which human beings learn to understand the world about them as they pass through it. In the past that are left in their wake, but also in the oral histories and texts through which such actions are recorded, which I think we would probably all agree with. But then he goes on to say, walking and writing are clearly complementary activities, and there is a pedestrian canon, which is, despite notable exceptions, predominantly male. And he has a book that's nearly 300 pages long, and he gives 4 to women. Robin Jarvis, even worse, talking about women's writing as humdrum and derivative, but is of considerable interest in giving us a rare personal record of a notable female pedestrian. As such, one inevitably looks for gender markings in her representation of the experience of travel. I've got no recollection of a book about men's walking that considers their gender as significant enough to comment on. That thinks about, okay, so how is he out here when he's got children? Who's looking after the children? That doesn't interrogate any of those material details that women's writing always comes up against. And this sort of reduction of women's writing about walking to something that was just there for data. It wasn't of interest for itself, it was just boring and dull. So these were sort of some of this was the grist to my mill when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with Wanderers, was that I couldn't believe that this was right. I just didn't believe it. So I went off to the archives and started rummaging for stuff and finding stuff, and found huge amounts. And I'm still finding more and more. And there are already walking books after mine that are talking about different writers, which is absolutely fantastic. I hope very much that there will be many more to come, that there is so many interesting women to write about who have used walking for various purposes. So I thought it might be interesting just to spend a little bit of time thinking about not just the women in Wanderers, but also those I missed out, and thinking about the choices that I made in the book, which, because I made very particular decisions here. It's quite a narrow book in some ways, that there's only these 10 women, even though there are literally hundreds out there. But what I wanted to do was argue with people like Merlin Covey and Robin Jarvis, and to say, just here they are, they're really interesting, we should pay attention to them. They were writing about walking, and they're writing about walking matters. It's of literary importance. We should take that seriously. But there were lots and lots of others that I could have written about. I should have written about Isabel Wily Hutchinson for a start, but I didn't. She's someone I found since who is absolutely amazing. But people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who in 1796 goes to Scandinavia, which is somewhere no one goes to in the 18th century. No one at all goes to Scandinavia for fun. She goes there on a secret mission for her lover. She goes there with her daughter, and she undertakes all of these extraordinary excursions. And she's there under protest. Her lover is broken up, separated from her, but she's still there doing his work. And she writes all these very heartfelt letters back to him, which are composed on the cliffs. So she's walking, thinking about what it means to be the mother of a daughter in a society that so obviously hates women. And she's doing that while walking as someone who's not supposed to be out there on foot. And she's a fascinating woman to think about, but didn't necessarily link walking with her creativity, which was the crucial thing that I wanted to focus on. But she's absolutely fascinating. And someone like Jane Austen, who has, I think Elizabeth Bennett is probably my favourite literary character who walks. I love her muddy hems. I love the scandal that she inflicts as she walks around. I think that's one of my favourite bits of Austen is this appearance in the posh drawing room covered in mud. But Austen herself was walking frequently, but not very interestingly about it, talking about it was too muddy, the lane was really muddy and I didn't go out for a walk, or I went for a walk, and that was literally all she said in the letter. So someone who I didn't think I could tell a good story about. But there were lots and lots of other characters who I would hope will appear in walking books to come. So just to sort of bring things around, I thought I'd offer some provocations to get us thinking about, well, what is walking? What does walking mean for us? We've got this history. We know we've got this history of women's walking. What might we do with that? So some things that I think we perhaps all of us collectively as a society and as individuals need to be thinking about is why mountain literature continues to marginalise or just ignore women's stories. Why is it so hard for them to get published? And it took a long time to get Wanderers published. I struggled, I still haven't got an agent, couldn't find a publisher. People telling me that they liked it, but they didn't think it would sell. How many other books are out there about women's walking that are going through that same process, that are struggling to get past the gatekeepers? Why do we continue to ignore that? So why are accounts of walking so reluctant, like Merlin Coverley's, like Robin Jarvis's, like all sorts of others, so reluctant to allow that women walked at all? All these received ideas about what women were restricted by rather than what women were able to do. What effect are the stories told in mountain literature? And this would be something perhaps that we can talk about in the Q&As, had on our experiences of walking. You know, what about the role models that we've inherited? And I know they've had an impact, and writing Wanderers for me was illuminating because I'd never considered myself as a woman walker before. And here was this history, this heritage that I could take with me and think about. That was transformative. I hadn't ever done that before. And what might we therefore do differently? What do we do differently when we have that history behind us? So I just wanted to offer up those provocations, some questions that I haven't answered at all, that writing Wanderers helped me explore, but certainly hasn't provided definitive conclusions for me, and which I'd be really interested in talking in the chat, talking in the Q&A afterwards with anyone about their own experiences or what walking as a woman means. So with that, I think looking at the time, I definitely better stop, because it would be really awesome to talk in the Q&A about all sorts of things to do with walking. So thanks very much. I'll stop there.
So, Kerri, why don't you get rid of your share screen, and then we can focus on you. There we go. Let me spotlight you. Spotlighted. Add mine. So I want to encourage everybody to send comments and questions via the chat. And I'm going to get us started with a question that addresses what you were just raising, that this book, aside from having the goal of educating us and enlightening us about these women walkers and writers, actually wants to also give us these role models so that we can go out there and walk with them in mind. So I'm curious about the reaction that you've had amongst women, amongst men. You know, how have people taken that up? And responded to the also to the general lack of understanding of women as walkers and writers?
Well, it's been one of the loveliest things to come out of writing the book has actually been people's women telling me what they've done differently as walkers, the routes that they've decided to undertake, and not necessarily because of what I've written, but because they've been introduced to people like Linda Cracknell, who goes off and walks all across Scotland, or Nan Shepherd, whose exploration of what it means to be human in the landscape just makes so much more sense for a woman than a man's version of that. That offers alternative ways of being present in the mountain. It doesn't have to be conquering. That's definitely been one of the most amazing things, is to hear how people have started to talk or think differently about their walking, because there's this sense of, okay, it's not just me. And one of the loveliest things I heard was someone say how important it was to be represented, to see themselves in a book. And as I say, when I was writing this book, I was not at all conscious of myself as a woman walker. That realization came gradually towards the end of the process of writing out. I sort of went, oh, okay, I'm part of this tradition. I'm part of this heritage. That's amazing. But that's something that other people have talked to me about as being a really important part of their experience of reading the book, is becoming aware of that tradition, that what they do is significant, that whether it's, you know, the 10-minute walk with the dog on the same track over and over again, that's worthy of consideration as an act of walking. It's not heroic, you know, no one's nearly dying on a hillside. It doesn't have to be suffering. These acts of walking are important, those everyday, common, domestic, with children, encumbered, slow, whatever it is, all of that matters. And the fact that much of those kinds of walking is done by women is probably one of the reasons why that kind of walking isn't written about, or hasn't been accepted to have been written about, because we do know that women were writing about those sorts of things. So it's been really interesting. It's made me feel connected to other women and other women walkers in a way that I wasn't sort of aware of at all before, and that's been a real privilege.
I want to encourage other people to send comments on the questions that Kerri put out to us. Talk about your own walking experience. But I'll add another one until we get some questions. So, excuse me. One of the things that, if you read the book, you see that there are many different kinds of writers. We're not all writers, but one of the things that comes through, and many of us, you know, anyone who walks understands that it opens up a space, it rids other things. And so our heads can fill with reactions to nature around us, to the people we're with, to our own thoughts. And so not everybody in the book is a writer, but they all had different purposes. And I liked that there was such variety. So I wonder if you could address that a little bit. So explain that there are urban walkers, pedestrians, and nature walkers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think including variety is really important, again, because there's this sort of monolith of what writing about walking looks like. That mountain literature it's got, I think it's really easy to pick out what the tropes of that are. And what I wanted to do again was to sort of disrupt that sense of, well, you know, a man goes to a mountain, he, you know, heroically conquers it, something bad happens, but he overcomes it, he comes home a hero, blah, blah, blah. You know, we've all read stories like that, and some of them are really entertaining, but they're not that varied. One of the things that surprised me as I was researching the book was just how varied women's walking is, how many different kinds of walking there are that people have found meaning in. And again, it's providing representation for people is something that I did accidentally. I wish I'd thought about what this book might mean in that sense, but I didn't. But it is something that's happened. So I do hope that people who live in cities, who walk the same park, or who enjoy walking the streets and watching people go by, feel like they're represented here. Anais Nin was one of the most challenging writers for me, because she completely transformed how I thought about city walking. And I was researching her and starting to write about her whilst I was staying in Boston. I was there for a month working in Harvard. I had a fellowship at the Houghton Library. And that was my one visit to Cape Cod was getting the ferry from Boston. So it was a fantastic month of exploring. But walking around Boston, it's the most walkable American city I've ever been to. And it was wonderful to do that. But I never really thought of myself or thought about finding pleasure in urban walking before. And there's Anais Nin on the streets of Paris, wandering around, totally aware of herself as a sexual being, aware of herself as a very attractive woman, and being completely comfortable with that, being comfortable with what comes with that, feeling in complete charge for the most part of the situation, able to engage or not with what's going on around her, being a disinterested observer for the most part, but this underlying current of sexual tension. So this incredibly powerful woman walking the streets, completely upending my sense of what street walker might mean. And within that, finding possibility for my own, you know, okay, I'm walking the streets of Boston. This is really fun. You know, doing all sorts of things in the city that I perhaps wouldn't have done. So there's lots and lots of ways in which that was important to me, just sort of challenge the notion that women did feel safe walking in cities. They write about that. That really matters. But also, you know, talking about the big mountains, the big landscapes, thinking about women in these spaces as well, which have been thought of as predominantly male because women couldn't or didn't go up there. So it was really important to me to include that variety of writers, people working in different forms, you know, journal writers, letter writers, poets, novelists, because there's such richness there. And my book really did just touch a fragment of what's out there. So trying to give some sense of the variety, which I couldn't really do to any significant extent. But I think that was an important part of what the book tries to do.
Indeed. So we have some questions coming in. The first one is about the author Rebecca Solnit, known to many of us. So what influence did her book Wanderlust or Wanderlust have on your own writing? And the person comments on her writing on the mud on her petticoat section about Austin.
Solnit was hugely influential, in part because she gets so angry about all of this rubbish. You know, she talks about these men's walking clubs, she says not the real clubs, but groups of similar people. She's really furious. And I found that fury to be energizing. You know, there is something to be annoyed about here. There is an injustice we've got to correct. So that sense of righteous indignation that we do need to make an intervention here, that really fired me, especially because it was not long after I'd read Coverley, Jarvis and the rest of them. I was feeling pretty hacked off. And here was someone who had seen the same sorts of things and had had a similar reaction, you know, just gut fury. And one of the things I like about Solnit in Wanderlust is the way in which she conducts that thought experiment about what it would have been to walk through the world if these male figures had been dressed as women or had experienced lives in female bodies, what that would have felt for them, what would they have achieved there. And I think that's a really interesting thought experiment. So she thinks really interestingly about that relationship. What I found slightly frustrating was that she didn't take very much time to talk about individual women writers who were walking, which is where I thought my book could make a difference. But that sense of this has to be corrected, there is a historical inaccuracy here which cannot be allowed to stand. That's absolutely from Solnit's book. And I don't think Wanderers would be the same without her having written Wanderlust. It really did, you know, serve as a touchstone throughout the writing process.
Wonderful. Another example of one person's effect of inspiring another to take it further, whether walking or writing. We have a comment that says, really good talk to get me thinking. Opening up the literature from women is so helpful. I hope to use this for a different view of my morning walk. And then we have a question, a great question. I'm wondering about your thoughts, what your thoughts are on walking so-called trophy hikes, which for us here in the US would be the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail. This is a little bit off the daily walk thread, but a very big part of walking and hill walking culture in this country and, as we know, in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who has avidly collected Munros, I'm definitely part of the trophy hiking community. But I'm also a domestic walker, a daily walker. And for me personally, those two things have to coexist. That I've missed the mountains during the pandemic. I'm missing the mountains now because I've got two small children. I live in the in the Scottish borders, which has got hills, but it's 100 miles to the mountains, which is a long way to travel when you've got two children and you're moving a whole house effectively to go anywhere with them. I really miss the mountains. I turned 40 recently. My husband's present to me was childcare so that we could go up a big mountain together for the first time in a couple of years. It was a wonderful present. So I climbed my first Munro for ages and I had forgotten how amazing it is to be above everything else. We got these glimpses of the valley below, rain backlit by the sun, so it looked like a silver curtain. It was just the most exquisite day. I had forgotten what a thrill that is. But I've also found enormous pleasure in walking. I live near the River Tweed, and there's a couple of really beautiful river walks that I do quite frequently with my family. My daughter is now old enough to go into a rucksack, which makes life much easier. So we've been doing a lot of those family walks too. So I think I would hope that in all of our lives that there's room for both the big trophies and the domestic, but I would hope also that part of what I hope that Wanderers does in the walking books that I know are coming after it is to reconfigure what we consider valuable walking, that you are going to be as proud of walking with your children, because that really matters. That really matters. As you are of being able to rough it out and pick up your food at three-week intervals as you're walking on the Pacific Crest Trail or whatever it is, or as you complete the Munros. But I also think it's really important that women are present on those trophy walks. I think it's important that women like Cheryl Strayed are present on the Pacific Crest Trail, that women in the UK like Hazel Strachan, who is I think on her 11th round of the Munros, so she's doing them back to back or something crazy. She's up there again this winter doing another round of Munros. She's a machine, and that's not necessarily attainable for anybody, male or female. Certainly not attainable for me, but I think it's really important for representation that women are there doing that too, that we can never say again, well, women don't want to, or women can't, or women don't like it. That in all of these areas of walking activity, all of which are important, women are there participating, finding within it specific or unique or different experiences and value, all of which matter, all of which we should be factoring into what we talk about when we say that walking is a culturally significant activity. So I'd hope that there's room for all of those kinds of walking and recognition that women are doing all of those kinds of walking too.
Great. I have one final question. I want to see if there's any more there, and then I'll turn it over to Lucy. I have a comment here. I grew up in New York and walked everywhere, as did my parents. Maybe that's where it started for me. New York is also a walking city. And I would add to your comment about trail walking or the trophy walks, that it's also a question of claiming time for oneself is one of the great appeals of lengthy walks. We're sometimes and very often limited in the time that we have, whether that's 15 minutes or 2 hours, but the generosity of time that a long trek gives is also one of the great appeals of that, and something that we sometimes are too busy or made too busy to claim for ourselves. So I want to conclude, request if there are any more, and then pose this one other question for you. Again, we're very often inheritors of the sense that women are challenged by fear, challenged by society, that there are obstacles put to us. But were there any advantages that these women had as women walkers?
Yeah, I think so. I think we also perhaps need to bear in mind that those senses of obstacles are really, once you try and pin them down, okay, where does that come from? They're really hard to pin down. The most dangerous place for a woman is her own home. It's not the mountain, it's not a walk, it's her own home. That is where women are most vulnerable. So we've got our perceptions of what's dangerous and what's not dangerous completely backwards. So I think that's one of the reasons why I find Ellen Wheaton's account of that mountain walk so refreshing, because she's just, it's terrified of the actual mountain. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to be frightened of. She is actual physical danger because it's a mountain. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. But I'm also sort of drawn to think about Dorothy Wordsworth and how she goes into and notices spaces that are absolutely female. She gets access to places that are just not available to men. I write in Wanderers about an incident where she's invited into the house of 2 women who are grieving the death of a child, who is laid out on the table in the house. It's an extraordinary, moving experience. And no man would have been allowed in there, none at all. So there's this whole experience that Dorothy documents because she's a woman walker. But elsewhere, she's also really interesting. She walks into Glasgow, and there's a really interesting moment because Samuel Taylor Coleridge is also keeping a journal, and he writes about what's going on Glasgow Green and sees something completely different. Whereas Dorothy observes the way in which the laundry is being undertaken by the women who were there. So I think there's a benefit in that women are able to access spaces, they're able to instigate conversations, there are experiences that are available to women that are not available to men. And thinking about my own walking, I talk to people when I'm on my own, people talk to me. I talk to other women when I'm walking on my own who wouldn't talk to me if I was walking with my husband. I've had some really lovely happenstance encounters. I got adopted by a family. I was walking Ben Crook, and I started off with my husband and my sister-in-law, but my sister-in-law didn't fancy it. It was a hot day. She felt ill, so they came down after we were about probably halfway up. And my husband, oh no, you must go on, which was fantastic. But we were quite late into the afternoon, so I didn't get to the summit of Ben Cruachan until probably 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a big horseshoe walk, and there's another mountain that you climb to come round the horseshoe. And I remember sitting on the top of that mountain going, oh my God, this is really late. Oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh my God. But there was another family who said, well, would you like to walk with us? Oh my God, would I love to walk with you? That would be amazing. So we formed a walking party, which actually turned into this sort of mutual support group because they had no clue where they were going, none at all. There's this insane mountainside that they saw other people on. Like, oh, that must be the path. And I'm looking at my map going, no, we do not want to be going up there. Those people are stupid. We go down here. And they would have gone off there because their son was absolutely confident that that was the way. But I managed to guide us back down onto the right path. And we had this really interesting day. It was a family of a father, a mother, and their daughter and their son, and me. And there's no way that would have happened if I'd have been a man. And it was just this wonderful experience. It was made more wonderful by the fact that my husband had been off to the nearby town, Oban, bought fish and chips, had it wrapped in tin foil, and then plonked it onto the engine unit in the car so it stayed hot for when I got down off the mountain at about 9 o'clock. I was absolutely starving. So that was a fantastic walk for lots of reasons. But I think there are those moments, and maybe other people have had them too, where when you're out on a walk as a woman, things open up for you that I just don't think are available to a man. So I think that for me is that's the advantage of being a woman walker, is people treat you differently, which is a good thing.
All I can say is, wow, this has been phenomenal. Really great having you join us today, Kerri. Thanks everybody for signing on. I hope, thanks of course to Margaret at the Woods Hole Library, and to Pamela for doing the intro and the questions and helping us with all the technical details that we're rusty on. Kerri, I hope everybody reads your book, not just women.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. Thanks everybody for coming. And here's to walking for all of us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you for the lovely comments too. Really great to read those. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you. It's great.
I think I get to leave. Way to go.